recording this session, and we will post the video and the slides later on the Select website. So welcome to today's Select Brown Bag networking presentation. I'm Dr. David Christensen, the Executive Director of Select, the Sustainable Electrified Transportation Research Center. And it's my pleasure today to have with us and to introduce to you Ali Kelly from the RAE and Amy Ford from ITS America. Now I'll let Ali and Amy further introduce themselves, their organizations, and their topic here in just a moment. But as we get going here, just a couple of items to remember. We'll present here for about 30 minutes, after which we'll conduct a Q&A and a discussion session. Some of you may have questions in the middle of the presentation. I'll let Amy and Ali determine if they want to handle those at the time or if we want to save those until afterwards. If you haven't already, please mute your microphone for now. And then again, I remind you that we're recording this session. We'll post it later on the Select website. So with that, Ali and Amy, I'll turn the time over to you, and we'll proceed until about 12:35 or so, and I'll pick it back up from there. Go ahead.
Excellent. Ali, I'll let you, do you want to start the introduction and pull up the slides? Great. All right, so I apologize, this is a rather large slide, but I wanted to introduce myself and say welcome. For those of you who are not familiar with ITS America, ITS America obviously is an organization, a nonprofit organization comprised of a variety of different members, whether they are public or private. Member states, DOTs, transit agencies, cities, metropolitan planning organizations, as well as many private sector partners. And our private sector partners range all the way from all the major auto manufacturers to telecoms or associations to major A&E firms, engineering firms like AECOM and others, Ford, Toyota, Audi, Crown Castle, Panasonic, you name it. We have sort of a series of different members. And why do they belong to ITS America? Well, the goal of ITS America is, as the Intelligent Transportation Society of America, we have this goal of advancing intelligent transportation. You know, for years and years, that meant things very simply like variable message boards or really interesting traffic signals. But it is clear in today's day and age that mobility is moving rapidly, the advances of technology are moving rapidly. And when we talk about what end we are trying to achieve as an organization, as our focus, and some of you might want to go on mute since you're sort of overlapping a little bit, is really for a safer transportation system, for one that is smarter, that really harnesses these technologies, and ultimately one that is greener. And that's why I'm here on the phone today with you all and on this call. Is in my previous role as the Chief of Advanced Mobility within the Colorado Transportation Department of Transportation, we were working avidly on how we move forward with sustainable technologies to really create a cleaner transportation system. This is also relates to our partnership that we had with Ali and with the RAE. But as ITS America is looking at all of this, what is a greener future? What is one that is clean? We all know that transportation is one of the leading causes of air pollution and congestion. You know, we have congestion on the roads as well as congestion in the air, let's be honest. And so how do we, as an advocacy group and with the partners that we have, continue to push for a greener future? And so to that end, I wanted to make just some very brief introduction and then really turn it over to Ali. That greener future for us is as much also related to what is happening legislatively, what is happening federally, and how do we create flexibility in the programs that are funded within the US DOT, whether it be through FTA, whether it be with FHWA. How do we create more of an environment that allows for renewable energy projects that would be on our right-of-ways and our highway systems? How do we create for renewables when it looks at you know, continuing to advance our EV charging infrastructure? And this is something that we are actively playing right now. I think many of you are aware that the FAST Act's reauthorization is happening as we speak. There are some very aggressive goals that our congressional members have set in regards to what they would like to do with the reauthorization here by this summer, as well as some clean corridors. And so we are playing a very active role in that. And so I want to turn it over to Allie to sort of take you through what the big picture of that means and what some of the areas that people are looking at touching when it comes to federal legislation, some of the barriers and some of the opportunities that exist, and how we continue to accelerate for a greener future. So Allie?
Thank you so much, Amy, and thank you, Dave, and the Select Center for the opportunity to have this conversation as a part of this month's Brown Bag. I want to introduce myself first. I'm the Executive Director of the RAE. For those who have not heard of our work, the RAE is headquartered in Atlanta and in LaGrange, Georgia. We are an 18-mile stretch of active working interstate. It's actually Interstate 85. And our 18-mile corridor begins at the Georgia-Alabama state line and extends 18 miles north on Interstate 85 to the LaGrange exit, which is exit 18. The RAE is not only an 18-mile stretch of working interstate, we're also a nonprofit organization. Our goals are to understand how technologies and innovations exist right now to help the transportation sector and our infrastructure to become a zero deaths, zero carbon, and zero waste system in the United States and around the world. Our work around decarbonizing transportation is hand in glove with our work around reducing waste and under-leveraged assets and infrastructure in the transportation system. In order to go zero carbon, a large part of that work is accomplished through electrification. Thus, this is our work with the Select Center in understanding how wireless and wireless dynamic electric vehicle charging is a part of a near future transportation system that is zero carbon and that is more efficient and valuable system for economic development and for freight. In addition to that, we have done a lot of work at the RAE in understanding how the roadside acreage and other infrastructure and assets in the transportation sector, including overpass bridges, might be utilized and be given the opportunity to multitask, if you will, through renewable energy generation. These concepts are not originally ours at the RAE, but what our opportunity is as a nonprofit organization is to work in an expansion of the public-private partnership to add philanthropy. So we're actually working in a P4, a public-private philanthropic partnership with our state DOT, with FHWA and US DOT, with technology partners in the private sector, and also with private sector funders to enable demonstrations of technologies and innovations that will help us to achieve more electrification, decarbonization, and more leverage of the roadside acreage and the bridge infrastructure to generate clean, renewable energy that may be in the near future we can utilize right on the transportation sector in order to power clean transportation with that clean fuel. Over the years, the RAE has engaged in real demonstrations of this technology with our state DOT and others. Our very first deployment of technology was in the fall of 2015. We installed a solar-powered EV charging station at a state-owned and operated visitor center on FHWA property on the interstate just inside Georgia after passing across the Chattahoochee River from the state of Alabama. With this one DC fast charging station at the visitor center, we were able to open up the interstate to most electric vehicle travel between the two capital cities of Montgomery and Atlanta. Very early on, we understood that there is insufficient electric vehicle charging infrastructure on the interstate system to enable most electric vehicle travel. Electric vehicles such as the Toyota Prius, the Kia EV Soul, the Nissan Leaf, the Chevy Volt and Bolt, there simply isn't enough charging infrastructure to enable travel between major metropolitan areas, including capital cities. The other thing that we realized quickly through the process of this very first technology demonstration is that current US law prohibits the provision of EV charging as a commercial enterprise on the interstate system. We were forced to offer the EV charging free of charge at this EV charging station. And it's as a result of this technology deployment experience that we became aware of the need to modernize the US code in order to scale EV charging infrastructure on the interstate system across the country. There are very few actors and entities like the RAE who are willing to scale EV charging infrastructure at no cost to the driver. And our overarching interest is to scale EV charging opportunities wired and wirelessly as quickly as we can in order to provide the charging infrastructure for the coming electrification that we anticipate will be OEM driven beginning in 2021, 2023. So any US code restrictions around the commercial provision of EV charging has been a concern to the RAE and also to colleagues like Amy Ford and ITSA and the Select Center for many years. One of the things that we're going to talk about in today's webinar is the opportunities that we have at hand right in front of us to address some of these issues. The other thing that I want to talk about is the development of renewable energy generation on the right-of-way. This is an activity that actually began with Oregon DOT more than 10 years ago in 2008. Over the last 10 years, Oregon and then Massachusetts have been able to develop a limited number of solar power plant sites on the interstate right-of-way. The state of Georgia is currently engaging in a project, will be the third state in the nation, Georgia DOT, working with the RAE and Georgia Power Company to bring 1 megawatt of renewable energy to the roadside of the RAE, which is Interstate 85. Our site will be online in the next few months, and this is a public project, which means that all of the power will go to the grid. One of the distinguishing factors of our site is that it will be the first to use native pollinator flowering plants as a ground cover for the entire megawatt of solar. So we won't be the first pollinator-friendly solar in the US, but we'll be the first to cultivate pollinator-friendly ground cover under a solar array on the roadside of the interstate. The RAE is also working with UT Austin's Energy Institute right now to develop a public and free online tool for all 50 states to specifically evaluate their own interstate roadsides for solar development and understand what economic value that may bring to their states and to their respective DOTs, because there are revenue generation opportunities that are inherent in these roadside renewable sites. Just to give you a visual of what the roadside renewable site on the RAE will look like, cutting across the middle of your screen are the southbound lanes, and then the northbound lanes of Interstate 85, known as the RAE. We'll be utilizing one quadrant of a diamond interchange for the home of 2,600 high-efficiency solar panels generating 1 megawatt of power. The acreage is about 4.5 of a 5-acre diamond quadrant. And there is a required 40-foot setback, which is prescribed by the speed limit of the interstate that is hosting the roadside or the right-of-way renewable site. This is just to give you a visualization of what it will be like driving on the interstate. There's not much that differentiates a site such as this from a site in South Georgia or somewhere else in the country where large-scale renewables are being developed very quickly. The differentiation from this site is that you are required to have a crash barrier, the 40-foot setback, but then everything else is pretty much the same: an 8-foot fence, your solar array, lighting, and security. This is really an energy ecosystem for transportation. It's something that we at the RAE call the Transportation Energy Nexus. And this dovetails with our work with Dave and Reagan at the Select Center, as well as Amy at ITS America. The vision is that we begin to stand up and scale renewables, solar and wind energy generation along the roadsides, and also utilizing some of the single-use assets such as bridge overpasses. will generate that energy, will eventually have to provide high voltage DC grid infrastructure to carry that energy to the communities where it is being utilized. And the interstate system is a great footprint for the development and deployment of high voltage DC or HVDC grid lines. This is something that NREL has been studying for the last several years, how the interstate system in the United States provides a nice blueprint for HVDC deployment. And it dovetails nicely with the concept of scaling renewable energy infrastructure on the roadsides. Also, HVDC is a great backbone, and I think a necessary backbone for the deployment of wireless charging, dynamic charging in a lane of electric vehicles. You can see that the first U.S. public pilot outside of the test area that Select has developed in Utah, the first public pilot is planned for later this year or early in 2020. And this is a concept that Amy has had a leadership role in developing the smart powered lanes. You can see how the energy ecosystem and transportation works seamlessly together, where you have clean energy being generated on the roadsides, the energy being handled by an optimized grid system, optimized for renewables like HVDC, which could also feed smart powered lanes. So what are the barriers to this vision and this future forward infrastructure occurring at scale in the United States? The first piece of this that I want to discuss with you is the electrification piece as it relates to smart powered lanes or wireless dynamic EV charging in a lane, as well as it relates to wired EV charging and truck stop electrification, which is an opportunity for diesel freight vehicles to idle on grid power instead of idling on their diesel engines during their required rest breaks. I want to draw your attention to the United States Code Section 23 U.S.C. 111, which is explicit in its prohibition of commercial establishments serving motor vehicle users on interstate rights of way. This may be an aha moment for some of you, but this is why we don't see EV charging, wired EV charging offered at visitor centers, rest areas, and other facilities that are existing and operating directly on the interstate system. This prohibition, of course, does not apply to highways and interstates like turnpikes and tollways that are private in nature and that do not have at their root funding source federal funds from USDOT or FHWA. This piece of the U.S. Code only relates to the interstate system as it was funded by federal funds in the 1950s and 60s and continues to be funded in maintenance by federal funding. So this is an explicit prohibition on electric vehicle charging offered either as a wired service along the interstate system rights of way, or offered as a wireless and dynamic smart charging lane opportunity on the operating travel lanes of the interstate system itself. And is also a barrier to truck stop electrification on the rights of way of the interstate system. Furthermore, not only do we have the explicit prohibition on serving motor vehicle users with commercial services or commercial establishments, but furthermore, we have a very specific list of commercial activities that are allowed within the rest area. That list of limited commercial activities within the rest area is very specific, and it does not include electric vehicle charging in any of its forms or truck stop electrification. It includes things like lottery machines, tickets for local events or attractions, commercial advertising, tourism, including books and DVDs, and travel-related information. It's a very short list and a very specific list that cannot reasonably be interpreted to include any of the electrification services that we're discussing today. And then the U.S. Code also speaks to the the provision of vending services and the definition of vending machines. I want to draw your attention. There was an attempt in 2016. FHWA proposed to expand the definition of vending to include EV charging. The results of that Federal Register notice that contained the proposal by FHWA and USDOT to expand the definition of vending to include EV charging closed at the very end of the year in 2016 with no action because the results or the comments back were about 50-50, and the federal government deemed that inconclusive. So there have been attempts in recent years to redefine vending in order to get at least EV charging allowed at visitor centers, rest stops, but that has been an avenue that was not pursued and has not been picked up since. Furthermore, as it relates to the development of solar and wind energy generation in the rights of way, there exists some lack of clarity and inconsistent definitions or inconsistent interpretations of the U.S. Code 23111 as it relates to that word commercialization and the restrictions around commercialization. You have to understand when you look back at the code, this is what I would say relic code from the 1950s, 1960s period. Commercialization is really intended to mean a private sector party earning revenue or income off of an activity offered on the interstate system. This was code that was meant to protect the public nature of the infrastructure that was being publicly funded through the federal government when President Eisenhower built the interstate system. That being said, the FHWA and USDOT have published the interpretation of 23 USC 111 as it relates to roadsides renewables, and that interpretation is relying on 23 CFR 645, not to get too wonky, but basically the FHWA has determined that if you have a utility that is building a solar project or a wind project in a way that will serve the general public, they can do so under the interpretations of 23 CFR 645. A utility can mean a traditional utility or a solar developer. The definition of public is most easily described as power going to the grid. So what I'm describing is the pilot that we have currently under construction here in Georgia with Georgia Power, which is a utility working in a grid project, which would be deemed as public. We should be able to proceed projects like this one in Georgia and others that might involve private sector solar developers sending the power to the grid. We should be able to develop those without restrictions involving revenue, income, or profit making by the private sector entity because of two reasons. Number one, it's already well established that utility accommodation is not a prohibited commercial use. And number two, the focus of our groups in the private sector and public sector, as well as the FHWA and USDOT, should be the return of value to the interstate system and the modernization of the interstate system in advance of advanced mobility and modern mobility challenges, refreshing and advancing that infrastructure to accommodate future mobility with private sector partners without being finally focused on the profit margins of the private sector partner. This seems like a pretty obvious statement, but it is going to be extremely difficult to attract private sector partners to public-private partnerships to achieve these infrastructure improvements or to achieve this new infrastructure like wireless dynamic charging lanes. We simply won't be able to attract quality partners if the goal of of FHWA and US DOT is to make sure that they don't make $1 more than the cost that they have sunk into the project. And we have to be able to balance our considerations with, yes, there's a return of value to the private sector partner, but we're mostly concerned about making sure that we're leveraging the return of value to the interstate system. I mentioned there are a lot of revenue opportunities specific to renewable energy generation on the roadside. To a state DOT, there's a day one opportunity or a day one benefit because that property, that acreage is no longer a maintenance obligation of the state DOT, and this could be tens of millions of dollars or more that state DOTs are budgeting every year to maintain their roadside acreage, i.e. to mow the grass or to spot spray for invasive species, or to clear back tree limbs. So that's a day one benefit that you can save on those maintenance dollars. But furthermore, a state DOT is allowed by FHWA to consider charging fees for the land licenses or the land leases. You can also negotiate for a portion of the renewable energy credits and monetize those on the market. You could also, as a state DOT, achieve better energy rates through PPAs, through power purchase agreements. And so you're not only reducing your maintenance costs, but you're also reducing your energy costs. And there's no explicit prohibition against state DOTs getting into the energy business themselves, working with solar developers to develop these sites and selling the energy on the grid in states where energy is an unregulated market. So with all of that value and all of those brand new revenue streams that are available to the interstate system and to state DOTs, not only is it clear that utilities and a public project to bring on renewable energy on the roadside to the system is not a prohibited commercial use, but in fact, we should be focused with state DOTs on figuring out how to get as much value out of these projects and scaling them as quickly as possible, as opposed to micromanaging to the nickel and dime the amount of money that a private sector partner may make off of the sale of these electrons that are going to the public grid. We also, just lastly, need some clarity and consistency across the 50 state division offices of FHWA and within headquarters, that areas that don't have quote unquote secondary access on the interstate system, this is going to be our clover leaves, our center medians, and the acreage at our visitor centers and rest stops, where you don't have an intersecting road that's not a part of the interstate system, so there's no quote unquote secondary access. These lands will be locked away from development for solar energy unless we can achieve that clarity from FHWA that secondary access is not required by the feds. It may be that a state DOT utility accommodation policy might require the secondary access, and that would be an insurmountable barrier to a project moving forward. But if a state DOT is not requiring secondary access, we need to be clear that FHWA does not require secondary access. And that will open up the acreage of cloverleafs, large center median areas on divided interstate highway systems, as well as the acreage at rest areas and visitor centers. The point of all of this is that we have opportunities in the transportation sector to achieve efficiencies, clean power for clean transportation through all of these technologies coming together in a transportation sector that is currently largely single use and not multitasking, and we can bring these renewable energy and electrification technologies to the transportation sector to achieve a better leverage, new revenue streams, multitasking assets, so that we have clean transportation powered by clean power that is developed right there or is generated right there on the transportation system. Currently, the U.S. Code contains relic language around commercialization and limited or prohibited commercialization as it results to all of these activities that we've discussed: wired EV charging, dynamic wireless EV charging in a smart powered lane, truck stop electrification, and the development of wind and solar energy on the roadsides and on the single-use assets to feed clean power to HVDC that can then feed power to smart powered lanes. This is a photo from the Ray of our solar road pilot that was developed by a French company called Wattway by Colas. Yet another example, perhaps it's not thousands of miles of travel lane on the interstate system paved with solar cells, but certainly we could be deploying technology like this on the hard paved shoulder of the interstate system. But yet again, this is something that we cannot proceed with because at this point, the interpretation is not clear and not consistent that these kinds of technologies are deployed on the interstate system in a way that is commercially viable. With that being said, I want to just draw your attention to the references for all of the pieces of the code and regulations that have been and interpretations that have been promulgated by USDOT and the Federal Highway Administration. The Federal Highway Administration has actually issued a large set of guidance and a quick guide as it relates to right-of-way renewables. All of these materials can be found at these links. We have an unprecedented opportunity right now, as Amy mentioned, with the FAST Act, as well as with a Senate bill that establishes a $300 million grant fund nationally to fund EV infrastructure on the interstate system. So we have two different policy vehicles, FAST Act reauthorization and a Senate bill that would establish a $300 million grant fund for interstate EV charging. And we are currently developing language with the Senate that addresses the right-of-way renewables issues that we have discussed today. Number one, the public project involving a utility being outside of the limitations or boundaries of commercialization. And number two, language that would clarify that there is no need for secondary access when it comes to cloverleaf, center median, and rest area acreage on the interstate system. So we are moving forward right now to address some of these issues, and we need your support and we need your input if you're so moved. We are also working to address the commercialization restrictions on the EV charging offered as a wired or a dynamic wireless smart powered lane opportunity that the Select Center is working on. We cannot scale the technology being developed by the Select Center on the interstate system without addressing RELIC US code. We have to modernize the policy in order to make way for the public-private partnerships that will modernize the infrastructure. With that, I want to turn it back to Amy and see if Amy will have any other information to offer on smart powered lanes.
Because we're at 30 minutes, I'm actually going to just leave it there. I think you had a perfect close, Allie. And, as we're all moving through this, both, from my past life and working to implement these projects through the partnerships that we had with Array, as well as with Select, there are a few projects potentially moving forward. The Illinois Tolling Authority is keen to look at how we look at dynamic in-road charging. NREL, another partner who is not necessarily on this call, is also pursuing the same. And I think Allie sort of hit the nail on the head in talking about what it takes not just to make this happen is not just the technology needs to advance, that you need to have partners like the Illinois Tolling Authority, you need to have partners, in the A&E and the construction world, but you also need to have the policy environment and the funding environment, the flexibility by which to be able to move forward. And so, we're excited that you guys are on the call today, and I think really a better course process would be to talk and answer some questions.
So Amy, let me jump in at that. Thank you, Allie, also both of you for that presentation. I think very timely discussion. Certainly it illustrates the integrated and codependencies nature of the topic area. And I think teeing it up really nicely for a good discussion here. Let me just take one moment, if I could. I want to welcome anybody who joined us a little bit late after we started. Again, a reminder that we're recording this for later access. And so if you have a question, please just unmute your microphone. You're welcome to send questions to me through the chat if you like to, but we'll open it up for about 15, 20 minutes for some discussion. Go ahead.
And if we've stunned everyone with way too much information. One question I am curious, and this will be just for later, is of those people on the call, any who may be also members of ITS America, because we also have policy working groups and other ways that we're engaging our membership into this discussion. So in how we're doing our policy advocacy side, working with folks like Ali and others. So a conversation for another part that I'd love to be able to have some insight on.
The first question actually came to me on the chat. Will the presentation be available to everyone or all the participants here? And I guess that chat went to everyone. But the answer to that is it will be available on the Select website. We do have a members only access. If you're not a member of Select, we can either have that conversation. There's a fairly low fee for industry members, for nonprofit and government members. There's no fee. So we can have that chat also for those who are on the call who are interested. If you're not a Select member, talk with me individually, send me an email, and we'll make sure that you get access to the slides and the video. And then there's another one there, looks like from Pam Fisher. Have petroleum marketers provided any feedback on your program? I'm always interested in the government affairs side of the project. I don't know who, Amy or Ali, you might want to address that first.
I'll let Ali take that.
So we are working with some very specific legislation with legislative vehicles, and the petroleum marketers, as well as the truck stop operators and other interest groups that you might question their alignment on this issue, have been engaged. And right now we have a fragile consensus about the changes to the U.S. code, the modernization that would achieve some clarity around roadside renewables. We are also discussing opportunities to address the electrification restrictions on commercialization through, perhaps various innovative pilot programs to begin with. But our long-term goal, as I said, is to address the code head on with the commercialization restrictions as it relates to EV charging and truck stop electrification, whether that's a smart powered lane operating on the interstate system or a wired EV charging station operating at a visitor center. And I don't know where the petroleum marketers will be on that ultimate goal, but we're just working on as a incremental progress on how the notion of commercialization and the prohibitions and limitations around commercialization, how those need to change in the U.S. code in order to facilitate modern infrastructure being built through P3s.
Very good. Additional questions or comments? Go ahead. David Eccles with EVIA, did you raise your hand with a question? Sorry, I can't tell here. I think I see David trying to ask a question, but I don't see his microphone working. Okay, no, I had not yet.
Maybe I could ask a question. This is Chris Fossen at Utah State University. Where is the opposition coming from on these recommended policy changes? It just seems like it's so obvious that, policymakers would have an incentive to modernize the infrastructure. So where is the opposition arising, and how are you addressing that kind of opposition?
Ali, you want to start? Yeah.
Sure, I'll take that, Amy. There are services offered off the interstate at exits, and those services are provided by large global or national entities that are making a lot of profit from the provision of those services off the interstate, and they are dependent on drivers leaving the interstate at the exits to procure those services. There's concern by the truck stop operators, the convenience stores, the petroleum marketers, and so-called big oil, that if you proliferate EV charging or truck stop electrification, either within the travel lanes of the interstate system and or at the visitor centers and rest stops or the rest areas along the interstate system, that the captive market will no longer need to get off at the exits to receive those services. And the captive market, I mean, is the drivers, right? If the drivers don't need to leave the interstate because they've got EV charging or truck stop electrification, and they've got you know, kind of their comfort break facilities right there on the interstate, then they might not leave the interstate at the exits, which means that the customer base of those truck stops and convenience stores and even the fast food restaurants at the exits, that their customer base would decline.
Yep, I was going to say the same. I mean, the same concerns that drove this legislation, you know, 70, 80, 90 years ago are the same that drive some of the concerns today. And, you know, rest stops were an ideal location if you look at the way the code was originally written on the rest stops, it's very specifically designed to be the bare necessities in between points of private sector comfort and aid, as Ali noted. And that is still a primary driving concern for folks, is that if you start proliferating these services within rest stops or others, that it eliminates the need to have private sector involvement off the road. And, you know, to that end, I think, you know, one of the things that you're not seeing because of the desire still to keep moving forward on building the electrification infrastructure is the private sector partnerships right now with groups like ChargePoint and the others are an interesting piece to this. You know, with every state, you know, Colorado, I'll use there as examples. We recently issued a P3 partnerships in which ChargePoint is going to be deploying their services along different corridors. All of those corridors are in combination with private sector partner land agreements. So gas stations or other locations. It creates a pretty restrictive environment about where those go and create very complicated P3 arrangement where there are negotiations again with those private sector landowners as well. So I bring that up because I think we all recognize that there's a lot of complication in that process for the P3 environments. But as groups like ChargePoint and others move forward, they too will be looking at this. If we're using public right-of-way, some of their business model gets impacted too. So it's a really interesting swirl of activity happening right now. Not that there's any conclusion, but just a lot of interesting swirl.
Mm-hmm. It is imperative for us to engage and to seek the support of the membership of the Select Center, because we are all partners in Select because of our interest and our belief in the technology of smart powered lanes. And we will not be able to leverage smart powered lanes technology on the interstate system until we address the needed modernization of this code. And then, you know, beyond that, we're also artificially limiting revenue opportunities and revenue diversification for state DOTs. State DOTs could be working with Electrify America, ChargePoint, Green Lots, truck stop electrification companies,
our utility
like
partners.
To develop these services at visitor centers and rest areas. And DOTs could be leveraging a parking lot lease or a parking lot license with a fee and realizing some revenue from allowing the provision of those services for electric vehicle drivers or for freight vehicle drivers. And furthermore, we've got massive opportunities with utilities and solar developers to develop clean energy generation along the roadsides of the interstate and at the visitor center, which, by the way, could provide clean power to all this electrification that we've talked about. There are so many different, you know, sources of revenue embedded in that are brand new to DOTs. So we're actually kind of stuck in amber, held back by, you know, 1950s era relic code that we need to address for any host of reasons that we believe the select membership cares about.
Good. Additional questions and comments? I might jump on and ask one as well. Amy, maybe referring to you as a former CDOT employee, State Department of Transportation. this really is implemented at the state level, yet there's this federal, I guess, with the code mandate that you comply with. And so what is it that a State Department of Transportation relative to those rest stops, or even in the case of not on a rest stop, but on the roadway itself with a smart power lane, for example, is there influence that a state DOT can affect on that federal code, whether it's adapting that code or even introducing, potentially new code?
Yeah, we're looking carefully at a couple of those things. So we have, for instance, been looking at our right-of-way related to our park and ride system and interpretation of the way our state laws impact whether or not we can start charging for charging on those, and some interpretations that are trying to create more flexibility. As we all know, though, I think that the real risk here is through pilot studies, there are certain things that we can do in pilot projects, and how we advance the technologies, for instance, that are coming off of what a Select is developing and what other technologists are coming in with smart powered lanes. But when push comes to shove in creating a new business model, and I think Ali pointed it out well, we have long talked about a transportation department as being that of a utility and that model. And we have not treated ourselves as such for a long time. And we are someone who builds the infrastructure and then people use it. And for all intents and purposes, the 20th century utility model in how we paid for that, the pay for that service was the gas tax. We all know with the onset of electrification that is a dying tax. And so consequently, we are moving forward in a variety of different fronts as a DOT to start thinking about how you shift that model to a utility. You pay for the miles that you travel on a road. You pay for the electricity that you may draw from an infrastructure. You pay for perhaps either other services, whether they be data or Wi-Fi, in that same kind of construct. That is a very big shift for a DOT to consider. And so I am not going to claim by any stretch that many DOTs are there. And so what you see are some of the projects that Ali was laying out. Some early steps into the concepts of charging, which you start seeing DOTs being a participant of, but not a recipient of the benefits, if you will, when it comes to the utility model of payment. The closest recipients that we're getting right now when it comes to electrification is the kind of model that Ali discussed with what they're going to be doing on the right-of-way side, and we all know this. If you're doing solar right-of-way, if you could draw the energy back into powering certain elements of our infrastructure, that is a benefit to a DOT and a benefit, obviously, to the drivers from a safety and a perspective. As it regards to sort of a revenue diversification model, it is certainly not yet at this point. So I'm being long-winded to sort of say that our opportunity to influence on an advocacy side is starting. ITS America is taking a very close look at this with our member organizations and starting to look at how we promulgate more flexible policies. AASHTO is having some of these early conversations. To be perfectly frank, the conversations that AASHTO is having right now are very oriented around electric charging stations and not yet really even into the solar pieces of this. This is something that is very nascent and just starting. Again, as we know, Oregon did this about 10 years ago, and not many have followed suit for a variety of reasons, and now I can get into some of that. But so I think it is going to be through the demonstration projects of pilots that Select does, through the increase of electrification in the charging stations, to be able to sort of build a pathway. Are we going to have success in immediately eliminating the restriction of the commercialization of our right-of-way? I think it's going to be baby steps, to be perfectly frank. And this is something that we're starting to work on, I think, from ITS America's perspective, as we're working with our membership. It is going to be on baby steps, and electric charging and the diversification and flexibility of funding is one of the first starts, and being able to use federal funds to help pay for some of these. And then that flexes some of the use on the charging side, so the payment side of it. But Ali, I don't know if you want to jump in on that or not.
Just to say that the legislative effort that we're working on at the RAY with ITS America also includes the support of local governments. For example, Lake County, Florida has already expressed their support for the modernization of the code to address right-of-way renewables and commercialization. as has the National Group Conservatives for Clean Energy. They're also supporting these changes. And there are a variety of state DOTs that are also looking at expressing a support position for this. We have to be nimble in creating interest groups that support an expansion of electrification and clean energy generation along the transportation sector to open up all of these opportunities for near future advanced mobility that we all work on with the Select Center. And so that interest group is already beginning to form, and I hope that folks will give a hard look to the information that was provided today and consider lending their hand and their name in support.
Well, let me even take a step beyond that. Typically, when we do these Select Brown Bags, they're topics of a much more technical nature. And as we discussed this both with you, Amy, and Allie, we thought that this might be some valuable information for our members. And so it made a lot of sense to present this. Now, there may be some here on this call, we've had about 45 people on here, some of which are academics and some government, state DOTs and otherwise, but a number of industry members as well. Next steps for anybody who's interested in taking this beyond just an informational review.
A next step would be to reach out to Amy Ford or Allie Kelly for more information, or we even have kind of model letters that your organization or your entity can consider signing on to in support of the legislation. We're also creating a list of organization names and logos that support the legislation, because as I said, this isn't Allie and Amy shopping around legislation hoping that they'll find some interest. This is us responding to a Senate request, a U.S. Senate request for language that would begin to address the barriers, the artificial barriers to modern infrastructure that the U.S. Code, as it's currently written, presents because of its commercialization restrictions. So would encourage everyone to reach out. My email is allie@theray.org, ALLIE, and Amy.
I am aford@itsa.org. And I see that Dave has asked a question, and I was just going to make a comment. Welcome to politics, and that becomes the interesting part of these discussions. But as you all are Select members, and then obviously I'm looking at some of the names. I know some of you also are members of ITS America. To get involved with us in some of what we're doing on our policy side, we have the next 2 months now to put real meat to the bones on how these policy agendas move forward, within sort of how legislation is crafted and the like. And this is the beauty of your knowledge as researchers, as advocates, as A&E firms and others could help inform that piece of it as well. And so I think that would be incredibly helpful. Frankly, just your review of some of these policy statements that we may make. And this is something that we do on the ITS America side. So that would be another next step. And to flag that if you are there for us so that we could weave you into that process.
Great. So maybe in the last few minutes, Amy, coming out of Western States, maybe you want to take on David Eccles' question. I knew he had one burning in there. Did you have a chance to read his question there? Yeah,
and the gap areas. And, that is actually how we too in Colorado were potentially looking at this. So Dave's question, I think everyone can see it, is, could we focus on the gap areas given the range of what the EVs currently are? And some of our initial, I'm going to say Colorado now, and how we were looking at the wiggle room and the way the language currently crafted was, it's very clear that rest areas are there to provide services in between private sector service areas. That was the intent of the origination of why the rest areas were developed and where they were developed. And we thought that might be, to your point, that might be an opportunity for us to be able to frame out a potential opportunity to fill in those gaps. I mean, exactly like what you've said. And that could be something that we could look at, certainly, I think, too, with what Allie was talking about with the electrification fund. and whether or not we can start pulling it in the public sector use. I think it's a good idea, David. It's funny, just by reading your question, it prompted that discussion that we had about a year or two ago about whether or not we could finesse the language enough that would articulate the fact that EV services filling a necessary need in the gaps that would fit within that code definition would still be eligible. I think, Allie, given the experiences that you've had, that we didn't see it, we didn't think it would quite fly, but I think as a pilot, I think that could be an interesting opportunity, and is certainly in the P3 environment. And hi, Mike, if you want to add to that, I see Mike King at CDOT is on the line. Mike, do you want to add to that? Because they flat out told us no. That's what I thought. I thought we had a continued conversation about that. All right, so Mike's answering the question for me, folks. We thought the language looked a little flexible, and we were trying to be the lawyers to see if we could flex it to say, hey, gap services, this is why we could do it and charge, not give away the electricity. But Mike is informing that, yeah, our WevBus partners, and as you're aware, and Mike, if you want to come off mute, you can certainly talk about RevWest. I think most people are aware of the multi-state consortium in the West that's doing our electric vehicle charging corridors, but that's too bad.
It's a great idea for a pilot project that we might be able to work into the language that we're pushing on, or that we're promoting on right-of-way renewables. I would also just say, there are 50 state FHWA division offices that are not necessarily working on the same page. There's interpretations that vary significantly from one state to another, and quite simply, you get a different answer depending upon what state you're operating in. And if you're in Colorado, then you might hear that you can only do roadside renewables through PPAs that involve the state DOT, whereas if you're in Florida or North Carolina, they just tell you no, flat out. If you're in Georgia, they say that the utility can't make a dime of profit. And that's where so much of this clarity and consistency is needed. We need to fill the language gaps. We need to modernize the language, and then we need to come up with really innovative pilot projects that beg the question for the federal government to address, which is, how are we supposed to enable electrification and advanced mobility when the people who wrote the laws in 1950s couldn't see any of this coming? Of course, the U.S. law doesn't address any of these opportunities and any of these challenges because they didn't have the foresight in 1950 to see the technologies and the opportunities and the disruption in transportation that we're dealing with and that we have at our fingertips right now in 2019.
Well, Allie, I'm going to let that be the last word. We could keep this conversation going. I think it's a good conversation. I'm glad that it's happening, and certainly more to be had. So I thank both Amy Ford and Allie Kelly for their presentation and their insights today, and for the engagement here from our audience. Just a reminder again that this presentation will be available later on the Select website, and I've already exchanged some chats with some of you about getting access to that. The next Select Brown Bag will be in about middle May. We haven't pinned that down yet, so we'll announce that within the next week or two. Watch your inbox or the Select website for some more information and details about the presenter and topic. So with that, then this concludes the Select Brown Bag for today. We thank you again for joining us on the the road to the future of transportation, and we hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.